Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My last video on the Occupy movement was a bit ambivalent in the sense that while I understood some of the protesters to have legitimate grievances, I also saw many of their ideas to be filled with logical and empirical fallacies. This time, however, it seems that the Occupy movement has taken quite a disturbing turn. An article from earlier today in Crane's New York Business suggests that the protesters in Zuccotti Park in New York are now aiming no longer to simply express their ideas and their discontentment with the status quo, which of course they have the full right to do, but to actively disrupt the course of business. They plan to prevent the New York Stock Exchange from opening. And that to me is an assault on liberty, it's an assault on our prosperity, and it's an assault on Western civilization itself. The great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises was at one time asked, what is it that one could point to distinguish a free or semi-free economy from an unfree economy? Obviously, different economies have different degrees of freedom. No economy or society is perfectly free, but how do you distinguish the pretty free ones from the mostly unfree ones? And the answer that Ludwig von Mises gave was very telling. The mark of a free society is the presence of a vibrant, functioning stock exchange. Now, why is that? Why is a stock exchange so important? Well, this once again goes back to what is a capitalist system. A capitalist system is one that allows for the accumulation of capital for individuals to engage in great enterprises. And a stock market serves as a way of exchanging capital, as a way of channeling capital to the hands of individuals who would be better suited to managing it. The best and most productive function of a stock market is precisely for people who know something about a given company or a given business to gain more influence over that business and either directly or indirectly determine how that business will be run. So it's not so much even the day-to-day trades or the people who use the stock market to boost their retirement accounts that bolster the necessity of the stock market to human civilization, but it is actually those people who use it to actively channel the flows of capital to their most productive uses. And without that function, economic efficiency and the productive allocation of resources are greatly impeded. But it goes to an even more basic level than that. It's a question of freedom. People in a free society ought to have the right to buy and sell their property, including shares in companies, as they see fit. And to disrupt all of that, to prevent any of that from taking place, irrespective of the motivations of the people involved, is a travesty. It absolutely tramples on people's freedoms. Now, many of these protesters consider themselves disenfranchised or believe that the current system has deprived them of many of their liberties, and I think a lot of them have some fair points. But the answer to that is not to deprive other people of their liberties, especially considering that most of the individuals who participate in the New York Stock Exchange are part of the so-called 99% that the protesters claim to represent. Now, another disturbing part of this Occupy movement is that it does seem that a leadership cadre is emerging, and that leadership cadre is very much part of this egalitarian, anti-quote, greed wing of the Occupy movement. Some of them have even made statements to the effect of their objective is to eradicate greed from the world, as if a human emotion or a basic human desire can ever be completely eradicated. With this kind of impossible goal, all that can happen is for legitimate human enterprises and legitimate human aspirations and legitimate human ways to improve life a little here and there to be swept away. in the pursuit of an unattainable ideal, which is not a good ideal to begin with. This is what the communist revolutions undertook, and hundreds of millions of corpses are where that led them. One has to be very careful when analyzing these kinds of movements, because quite frequently the grievances that lead up to them, at least in part, are quite legitimate. When the French people rose up in 1789, they rose up against a genuinely, deeply oppressive system, the Ancien Regime, which had oppressed the French people for centuries. And initially, many of their demands were reasonable. Free political prisoners, establish some basic rights within the Constitution, create representative government, outlaw certain burdensome taxes. But in the tumult of that revolution, increasingly violent and increasingly egalitarian in a redistributionist sense factions came to take root. And eventually, a thuggish faction known as the Jacobins came to power and inaugurated the Reign of Terror, which first consumed the moderate revolutionaries and then turned on the Jacobins themselves, until finally the French people could have no more of it and overthrew and guillotined Robespierre, who was the greatest thug of them all. So there is a very dangerous slippery slope here. If the Occupy protesters allow these militants to influence them and to take hold of the reins of this movement, then even those militants might just be an intermediate step and will end up having armed thugs in the streets. That will be the fate of the Occupy movement unless the protesters decisively reject any activity that obstructs peaceful commerce. In Oakland, unfortunately, violent clashes have already erupted in so-called retaliation for the injuries of some veterans who were taking part in the protests. The protesters shut down commerce at the port in Oakland. Now, the obvious question arises, what in the world did the shipping businesses in that port have to do with the injuries inflicted upon those veterans by police? If the protesters were serious about proportionate responses to abuse, they should have been protesting at the police station, not at a port. The shippers had nothing to do with it, and the consumers of those goods had nothing to do with it. So why in the world are these protesters taking away the right of peaceful individuals, most of whom are by definition within the 99%, to enjoy goods peacefully procured through their own funds from willing sellers? If they want to fight injustice, the way to do it is not through more injustice. And a corollary fear is that the way local governments will respond and the way the police will respond is by cracking down also indiscriminately. Not just against the protesters who are genuinely disruptive, but also against protesters who just happen to be there, or protesters who happen to be nearby trying to do something peaceful. And that will set a terrible precedent for the freedom of expression in this country. And once again, the slippery slope of the reactionary side to this movement could be not just persecution of peaceful protesters, but persecution of anyone who dissents against the system, even if it's in the form of peaceful speech that can't possibly disrupt anything or impede on anyone's free choice. One has to be extremely careful with any attempts at mass social change. We have to remember that we stand on the shoulders of giants in terms of the civilization that we have. And while there are numerous flaws in the existing system, just shouting and blocking activity isn't going to fix that. What is going to fix that is some careful thinking about the kinds of reforms that are needed in order to empower individuals, in order to prevent corruption, in order to prevent tyranny, and in order to allow human innovation to flourish. That is the kind of thinking that needs to happen. And that kind of thinking is best done calmly, and not belligerently, and not in a way that creates peaceful victims. Thank you very much. I really do hope that these protesters come to their senses.